Hey there, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're stepping into a realm that feels, well, almost plucked straight from the pages of an adventure novel.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Think cities swallowed by jungle, mysterious hieroglyphs, achievements in science that seem almost impossible for their time.
Ah, okay. I see where you're going.
We're embarking on a deep dive into the world of the Maya civilization.
It really is a fascinating one. Holds a unique place in history, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Because on one hand, you have these incredible, tangible things, breathtaking architecture, really sophisticated knowledge systems.
Right. Stuff we can see and study.
Exactly. But then on the other hand, there are these profound, enduring questions. How did they build so much? What do all those symbols mean?
And maybe the biggest puzzle of all.
What happened? What happened to those flourishing cities from their classic period? Where did everyone go?
Exactly. And that's precisely our mission today.
All
We're
right.
digging into the material you've shared with us about the Maya.
Uh,
We're going to go through it together, try to pull out the most significant insights, and understand what we do know.
Okay.
But just as importantly, we're going to, lean into those mysteries, the things we don't know for sure.
Which, with the Maya, there are quite a few of.
Definitely. The goal is to give you, our listener, a clear, kind of layered understanding of this incredible civilization, exploring its brilliance and its mysteries, all guided by the information available.
Yeah, think of it like navigating a complex historical landscape. The material we have is our map.
Good analogy.
It'll guide us through the different eras, point out the major landmarks, their achievements, but also highlight those areas where the paths just, well, they disappear into uncertainty.
Perfect. So right off the bat, the material really emphasizes the sheer scale we're talking about here. This wasn't some small, isolated kingdom.
No, not at all. The Maya world was vast. Geographically, it stretched south from what's now central Mexico, all the way down through Guatemala, Belize, parts of Honduras, El Salvador.
Wow, so a huge chunk of Mesoamerica.
A significant portion, yeah. Roughly a third of Mesoamerica's total landmass. This wasn't just one culture. It was a vast, diverse collection of peoples and political entities, all interacting across this wide region.
And their history, like any long, complex story, unfolds over distinct periods. The material lays out a helpful timeline.
It does. It guides us from their earliest origins, way back in the pre-classic period,
Okay.
through their peak, the famous classic period,
Right.
and then crucially into what's called the post-classic period. This shows how Maya culture continued, how it adapted and persisted even after facing huge challenges.
So it's not just a simple story of rise and fall.
Not at all. The material makes that clear. It's about development flourishing, yes, but also major disruption and then this remarkable continuity. It's a much more nuanced picture.
All right, let's start that journey then, right at the beginning.
Okay, so our story really begins deep in the past. Around 2000 BC, give or take, this is the era known as the pre-classic period.
Pre-classic, got it. Runs until about 250 AD.
That's right. And the material stresses this wasn't just some vague early stage. It was the fundamental genesis, the absolute bedrock upon which everything later was built.
So what was the catalyst? What kicked things off?
Agriculture, plain and simple. This was a period when people started to shift away from being nomadic, following herds or wild plants.
Settling down in one place.
Exactly. A revolution in how they got food, driven by mastering the cultivation of plants. And one plant was absolutely key.
Let me guess. Maize.
Maize. Corn. The cornerstone of Mesoamerican life, really.
It fueled everything.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Successfully growing maize meant a reliable, storable surplus of food, and that surplus was essential. It allowed people to stay put, to gather in larger groups, form permanent villages,
And eventually cities.
and eventually the earliest cities. Those first settlements often popped up along fertile coastlines, first on the Pacific side, then later spreading towards the Atlantic lowlands.
But the source material doesn't just call this a beginning. It uses the phrase fully developed cultural moment. What's that getting at?
It means that even this early on, we see the core elements of what would become distinctively Maya culture already taking shape. We're not just talking simple huts and basic farming here.
Right.
By the later part of the pre-classic, you have societies that are quite complex. Early forms of their writing system and calendar are starting to emerge. Monumental architecture is beginning to appear. Social hierarchies are getting established.
So it wasn't just practice for the main event. It was significant in its own right.
Absolutely. This period forged their core identity and laid this really sophisticated groundwork for what would come later in the classic period, that explosion of culture and power.
But even here, right at the foundations, There's a hint of mystery already, isn't there? The material mentions a first collapse.
Yes, it's one of those really intriguing enigmas right at the threshold of their, let's say, well-documented history. Around the 1st century AD, so still quite early,
Yeah.
many of the major flourishing cities from this late pre-classic period experienced significant decline. Some were just outright abandoned, big centers like El Mirador in Guatemala, for instance.
Abandoned. Just
Yep.
left.
A-
Wow.
And that is the mystery. The reasons for this initial widespread abandonment are still debated. We don't fully understand it. Was it environmental stress? Internal conflict? Maybe disease? Something else entirely?
We just don't know.
We don't. And the material points out this wasn't just a blip. It wasn't an isolated incident. It suggests that the Maya civilization, right from its earliest complex forms, might have faced these inherent vulnerabilities or challenges that could lead to widespread disruption.
So this early pattern of cities declining or being abandoned, it hints at deeper issues, maybe recurring problems that would challenge them later on too.
Precisely. The material implicitly connects this early event to the much larger, much more famous collapse that happens centuries later at the end of the classic period. It suggests potential systemic tensions, maybe related to how they managed resources, or the pressures of social complexity or political stability, things that were present from the beginning and could resurface when things got tough. Understanding this first enigma might even shed some light on the later, bigger one.
It really adds layers, doesn't it? Reminds us their whole history wasn't just a smooth upward curve.
Not at all. There were periods of significant reversal, even in that foundational phase.
Okay, so leaving those hidden foundations, let's move into the era that really defines the Maya for most people, the classic period.
Yes, the heart of it all. This is roughly 250 AD to 900 AD, if the pre-classic was, building the stage.
The classic was the main performance.
Exactly, the spectacular performance. This is when we see Maya civilization reach its dazzling peak. Art, architecture, intellectual achievements, political complexity, everything just flowers.
This is the time of the great city-states, right? The famous names.
That's it. The material highlights the rise of those impressive carved stone monuments, the stelae that record history in ruler lists. And you get this complex network of powerful city-states. Places like Tikal in Guatemala,
Huge site.
huge. Palenque in Mexico, Copan down in Honduras, Calakmul, which was often locked in rivalry with Tikal.
So not one unified empire then,
Yeah.
like the Romans or Aztecs later on.
No, that's a crucial distinction the material points out. They weren't unified under a single emperor. Think of them more as independent, vibrant centers of power, trade, and knowledge. Sometimes allies, sometimes trading partners.
And sometimes at war.
Oh, frequently engaged in intense warfare with each other. It was a very dynamic, interconnected, but also competitive landscape.
And the power structure within these cities revolved around the figure the source calls the divine king. Tell us about that.
This is absolutely central to understanding classic Maya society and politics. The ruler, the Ajah, was typically a hereditary monarch. Succession often passed from father to son, so it was patrilineal.
Okay, standard enough for kingship.
But their authority went way beyond just being a political leader. The king was considered the vital link, the crucial mediator between the human world and the complex, supernatural realms of the Maya cosmos.
So they weren't just kings, they were more, like high priest.
Very much so. They were seen as the highest priests, yes. And critically, they were believed to be direct descendants of the gods who had created the universe and humanity.
Wow, direct descendants.
That divine connection was the ultimate source of their immense authority and legitimacy. They were supported by a powerful aristocratic elite, nobles and priests who helped manage the state, the economy, the complex religious rituals.
And the king's main job, in a way, was keeping that connection going,
Right.
keeping the gods happy.
Fundamentally, yes. The king's perceived ability to communicate with the gods, to appease them through rituals, to ensure good harvests, rainfall, success in war that was fundamental to their rule and the stability of the city-state.
That sounds like a system designed for stability, especially when things are going well.
Yeah.
But the material also hints that this very divine connection might have been a vulnerability.
That's a really key insight you can draw from the sources. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, that divine kingship.
How so?
Well, while it provided powerful legitimacy during prosperous times, it also placed immense pressure on the ruler. Think about it. If the society faced a major crisis, say, a prolonged, devastating drought, which we know happened,
Yep. Yeah.
And the king's rituals, his mediation with the gods, didn't seem to be working. If the rains didn't come, if people were suffering.
Then his divine connection looks pretty weak.
Huh.
People might start questioning his authority.
Exactly. A perceived failure to mediate effectively during hardship could trigger a crisis of legitimacy. It could lead to social unrest, challenges to his rule, maybe even open rebellion.
So the very thing that gave them power could also undermine it in bad times.
Precisely. It suggests the system that enabled their grandest achievements also contained this potential point of fracture when faced with overwhelming external pressures. It adds a really complex political dimension to the story of their eventual decline.
It's a fascinating paradox. The source of their strength also held the potential for weakness. Okay, speaking of strength, let's talk about those achievements. The things the classic Maya did that still leave us just amazed.
Absolutely. And you could argue one of the most incredible areas was their intellectual prowess, especially shown in their writing system.
Hieroglyphs, not just pretty pictures carved on stone walls, right?
Oh, far, far from it. The material really emphasizes how sophisticated this was. It was a fully developed writing system, the most complex in the pre-Columbian Americas.
How did it work?
It was this brilliant combination of phonetic signs that represented sounds, like syllables.
Like parts of words.
Exactly. And logograms, which were symbols that represented entire words or ideas.
So kind of like mixing an alphabet with like Chinese characters almost.
That's a rough analogy, yeah. You could write words by spelling them out phonetically using the syllable signs, or you could use a logogram for the whole word, or even combine them. This flexibility allowed them to record a huge amount of information with real nuance and precision.
And they used it for, well, everything, didn't they?
Meticulously. They recorded their history, tracing royal family lines back for centuries. They documented religious beliefs, scientific knowledge, astronomical observations, ritual practices, political alliances, accounts of battles.
Where did they write all this stuff?
On huge stone monuments, the stelae we mentioned, on altars, painted or carved onto the walls of palaces and temples, on beautiful ceramics, on carved wood objects, and, crucially, in portable books called codices.
Codices, like books.
Yeah, made from the inner bark of fig trees, beaten into paper, coated with lime plaster, and then folded up like screens or accordions. These contained vast amounts of knowledge. It's primarily through reading the surviving texts, the inscriptions, and the few codices that we've been able to reconstruct so much of their history and culture.
But there's a real tragedy connected to their writing, isn't there? The loss of most of those codices.
Oh, it's a truly devastating blow to our understanding, a cultural catastrophe. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, many of the priests and officials saw these codices, filled with Maya script and imagery, as pagan idolatry, works of the devil.
Because they weren't Christian.
Exactly. And fueled by religious zeal, particularly figures like Bishop Diego de Landa in the Yucatan, they systematically gathered and burned almost all of them. Just imagine. Burning libraries full of a civilization's accumulated knowledge and history.
How many actually survived that deliberate destruction?
It's heartbreakingly few. Today, only 4 undisputed, authentic Maya codices are known to exist. They're named after the cities where they ended up. The Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, the Paris Codex.
And the Grolier, right?
And the Grolier Codex, now sometimes called the Maya Codex of Mexico, just 4 fragile books. They offer us this tiny, precious window into their incredibly sophisticated understanding of astronomy, divination, ritual cycles, maybe some history. But we can only guess how much invaluable information about their science, literature, philosophy, daily life was lost forever in those fires.
Given that massive loss, the fact that we can read their writing at all feels almost miraculous. The material mentions the breakthrough in deciphering the Maya code.
This was genuinely one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century in the fields of archaeology and linguistics. For centuries after the Spanish conquest, the script was largely a mystery to outsiders. People thought it was just symbolic picture writing, maybe mystical allegories, not a true writing system.
So how do they crack it?
It was a long, slow process, building over decades. Scholars like Ernst Furstmann figured out the calendar and number system in the Dresden Codex. Later, Yuri Norazov, a Russian linguist, made the crucial breakthrough, realizing it was partly phonetic, based on syllables, using Bishop Landa's problematic but useful alphabet. Then, in the latter half of the 20th century, epigraphers like Tatiana Proskoryakov, Linda Schale, David Stewart, and others built on that, painstakingly matching signs to sounds, identifying names of rulers and cities, figuring out the grammar.
Wow, like solving the ultimate crossword puzzle.
Kind of. It required incredible dedication and collaboration, but the result was revolutionary. The code was cracked. We learned to read the phonetic signs, the logograms, understand the structure. We could finally unlock the voices of the ancient Maya themselves.
And this must have completely changed how we understood them.
Fundamentally, before the decipherment, our understanding was based mainly on archaeology interpreting buildings and artifacts, and on the accounts written by the Spanish conquerors, which were often biased, incomplete, or just plain wrong.
Right? Seeing them through an outsider's lens.
Exactly. Now, we can read their history as they wrote it. We can hear the names of their kings and queens, understand their political events from their perspective, get insights into their religious beliefs in their own words. It was a true revolution, allowing the Maya to speak directly to us across the centuries.
And even with the loss of so many written records, there's still a mystery in their cultural resilience, isn't there? How did their knowledge, their identity, manage to persist through centuries of decline, conquest, external pressure, when so much of their written history was deliberately destroyed?
That's such a powerful question about cultural survival, isn't it? It really suggests that their knowledge wasn't only kept in those fragile bark paper books.
It must have been embedded elsewhere.
It must have been deeply ingrained in oral traditions, stories, and histories passed down from generation to generation. It was encoded in the thousands of surviving stone monuments scattered across the landscape. It was embedded in their complex ritual practices, which continued even under Spanish rule, sometimes in secret. And it was carried within the memories, the languages, and the daily practices of the Maya people themselves.
So the culture was deeper than just the books.
Much deeper. This ability for a culture's core essence, its worldview, its identity to endure, even after the destruction of its most explicit records, speaks volumes about its depth and its resilience. It's truly remarkable.
Okay, moving from the written word to the language of numbers and stars. The Maya were also extraordinary astronomers and mathematicians.
Their achievements in these fields are genuinely astonishing. The material makes it clear they often surpass the knowledge of many contemporary civilizations, including, in some aspects, those in Europe at the time.
Did they have specific places for watching the sky, like
Well,
observatories?
Yes, they did. They built specialized structures, like the famous circular building known as El Caracol at Chichen Itza. Its windows and doorways seem to align with key astronomical events, especially the cycles of Venus.
Venus was important.
Hugely important. They tracked it very closely. It was linked to warfare and ritual, but they didn't just use dedicated observatories. They integrated their astronomical knowledge into the very fabric of their cities.
How so?
Pyramids and temples, like the big ones at Chichen Itza or Uxmal, were often built with incredibly precise alignments. They could track solar events like the equinoxes and solstices, maybe lunar cycles too. The architecture itself was a kind of astronomical instrument.
And mathematically, they came up with something truly revolutionary, right? Something rare globally.
Absolutely. The independent invention of the concept of zero, represented by a shell-like glyph. This was a mathematical breakthrough achieved by only a handful of civilizations in world history. The Babylonians used a placeholder, the Indians developed it fully later, and the Maya did it independently in the Americas.
Why was zero such a big deal?
Because it's essential for a place value number system. The Maya used a base 20 system, or a vigesimal. Having a symbol for zero allowed them to represent quantities accurately and handle very large numbers, which was crucial for their complex calendar calculations and astronomical predictions. You can't really do advanced math or precise long-term astronomy without it.
Which brings us to those famous calendars. The material mentions debunking myths about 2012.
Slight chuckle. Yes, thankfully. That whole 2012 end of the world thing was a complete misunderstanding or misrepresentation of how their calendar worked. It was simply the end of one major cycle in their long count system, like our odometer rolling over, not a prediction of apocalypse.
So what were their actual calendars like?
They had a really complex, elegant, and remarkably accurate system. They actually used multiple calendars simultaneously, interlocking like gears.
Multiple calendars.
Yeah. There was the Tzolk'in, a sacred 260-day ritual calendar, probably based on the human gestation period used for divination and scheduling ceremonies. Then there was the Hab, a 365-day solar calendar, much like our year, divided into 18 months of 20 days, plus 5 unlucky days at the end.
But 365 days isn't quite accurate for the solar year, right? That's why we have leap years.
Exactly. Their 365-day Hab didn't have a built-in leap day correction like ours, but they knew the solar year was slightly longer. Their astronomical calculations were incredibly precise, and that's where the third major calendar comes in. The long count.
The long count, that's the one that tracks huge spans of time.
Precisely. It was a cumulative system, counting days from a mythical starting point way back in 3114 BC. This allowed them to date events far into the past and project cycles far into the future with incredible precision. It's the long count cycle ending that caused the 2012 fuss.
And their calculation of the actual solar year length was very close.
Extremely close. And their calculations for the cycles of Venus were also highly precise. The material even points out that their understanding of the solar year's true length and how to account for it over long periods was, in some ways, slightly more accurate than the Gregorian leap year system we use today, which is just mind-blowing considering they didn't have telescopes or advanced instrumentation.
That level of empirical observation, that scientific precision, inventing zero, accurately tracking planets, building these incredibly precise calendars, it almost seems. Well, contradictory. When you think about how deeply their society was centered on divine kings, gods, rituals.
And that's one of the core mysteries, isn't it? We tend to draw this sharp line between science and religion in the modern West. For the classic Maya, that line seems to have been much blurrier, maybe even non-existent.
They didn't see them as separate.
It seems not, or at least not in the same way we do. Their empirical observations and mathematical mastery weren't separate from their spiritual beliefs. They were often deeply integrated. Astronomy and calendar calculations were vital for determining the right, auspicious dates for rituals, for warfare, for a king's accession ceremony. Their astronomical knowledge helped legitimize the divine king's connection to the cosmos and his ability to mediate with the gods.
So science served religion, in a way, or they were two sides of the same coin.
Perhaps the latter is closer. It was all part of understanding and navigating their complex cosmos. This blending of rigorous empirical science with a complex, ritual-focused cosmology reflected in their architecture, their calendars, their texts, it really challenges our modern assumptions about how knowledge and belief systems can interact. It's a fascinating paradox to grapple with.
Speaking of architecture reflecting all this, their monumental buildings are maybe the most enduring, visible testament to their ingenuity and this blend of the scientific and the spiritual.
They truly were master builders. Just incredible. They constructed these vast urban centers, huge plazas, multi-room palaces, soaring pyramid temples, ball courts, observatories using primarily limestone, which is abundant in the region, plus wood for beams and scaffolding, and stucco made from burnt lime for plastering and decoration.
How did they build such high structures, like the temples on top of pyramids, without using the true arch, like the Romans did?
They developed a very clever alternative, the corbel arch, or corbelled vault. Instead of using a keystone to distribute weight, they layered stones progressively inward from both sides of an opening until they met at the top, often capped by a flat stone. It creates a distinctive triangular arch shape inside buildings. It wasn't as strong as a true arch, limiting the width of spans, but it allowed them to create vaulted internal spaces and impressive roof lines using the materials they had.
And the pyramids themselves. Just the sheer scale is hard to comprehend.
Look at the Kukulkan Pyramid at Chichen Itza Castillo. The material details how it's not just a massive pile of stones, it's this incredibly sophisticated integration of math, astronomy, geometry, maybe even acoustics.
A number of steps, right?
Exactly. 91 steps on each of the four sides, plus the top platform, makes 365 the days in the solar year. And the way it's aligned on the spring and fall equinoxes, the setting sun casts shadows that look like a giant serpent slithering down the northern staircase.
Wow. That can't be accidental.
Absolutely not. These are deliberate design choices reflecting their deep understanding of the cosmos and their calendar. Building structures of this scale and precision requiring immense amounts of quarried stone, complex planning, and organized labor, all without draft animals like oxen or horses, without wheels for transport, and crucially, without hard metal tools like iron or steel. It's simply astonishing.
How did they quarry and shape the stone then?
Primarily using harder stone tools like flint and chert, and possibly employing techniques like using abrasion with sand and water. It would have been incredibly labor-intensive.
And these cities weren't isolated islands. They built connections between them, too.
Yes, the Sakbube, which translates to white roads. These were raised causeways, sometimes stretching for many miles through the jungle, paved with white limestone plaster, connecting major urban centers or important ceremonial sites within a city.
Like highways.
In a sense. They would have facilitated travel, trade, communication, maybe even troop movements. Building these Sakbube also required huge amounts of engineering effort and coordinated labor, demonstrating a really sophisticated level of infrastructure planning and management.
But the material we're looking at adds another layer. It suggests Maya architecture wasn't just functional or even just symbolic in an obvious way. It talks about a hidden intentionality. What does that mean?
This is where it gets really interesting. Moving beyond just astronomical alignments or representations of mountains, it suggests there might be deeper layers of design, intended perhaps to evoke specific experiences or to connect with the spiritual realm in ways we're only just beginning to grasp.
Like that recent discovery under the Big Pyramid at Palenque, the one mentioned in the material.
That's a perfect example, a remarkable finding announced in 2024. Using non-invasive techniques like ground-penetrating radar, archaeologists discovered a significant, previously unknown structure buried beneath the famous Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, the pyramid that houses the tomb of the great King Pakal.
Buried underneath, so it's older.
Much older. Preliminary dating suggests it goes back to around 100 BC, deep in the pre-classic period. This indicates Palenque's history as a major ceremonial center is much deeper than previously thought, potentially with influences from earlier cultures like the Olmec. Pakal didn't just build his magnificent temple, he deliberately built it on top of this ancient, sacred foundation, likely incorporating its power and significance. The Materian isn't exaggerating when it says this is rewriting history.
And the description of this hidden structure as introspective? That's intriguing. Different from the big pyramids.
Very different, it seems. Unlike the towering public pyramids, meant to be viewed from the outside and ascended for ceremonies on top, this buried structure seems designed primarily to be experienced from the inside. The material describes it as meant to be felt and walked through from within. It has different layout, perhaps more maze-like or chamber-focused.
And there was something about sound. Ritual thunder.
Yes, this is one of the most fascinating aspects. They found a vertical stone conduit, basically a channel, built within the structure. The hypothesis is that during the rainy season, when water flowed down through this conduit, it might have caused the chamber below to resonate, perhaps amplified by the enclosed space, potentially creating a sound like deep rumbling or thunder.
Wow. So architecture designed not just for sight, but for sound, for feeling, for a whole multi-sensory spiritual experience.
That's the incredible implication. Some researchers are now proposing that Palenque, or at least this ancient core, might have functioned as one of the first sonic cathedrals in the Americas. Using architectural design combined with the natural environment, the rain, to create specific auditory effects that were likely integrated into rituals.
And the idea that it might represent the underworld.
Exactly. If this buried, perhaps dark, resonant structure was conceived as Xibalba, the Maya underworld, it reinforces this idea that their architecture wasn't just symbolic representation, it was a living, interacting part of their cosmos, designed to facilitate connection with sacred realms, spiritual journeys, maybe even literally sounding like the rumbling of the earth or the underworld below. It adds such a profound, almost mystical layer to our understanding of their engineering and spiritual intentions.
It really gives you a whole new appreciation for these ancient stones.
Yeah.
Okay, we've marveled at their rise, their incredible achievements. Now we have to turn to the section that holds the biggest, most talked about, and maybe most haunting enigma of the Maya world, the classic collapse.
Right. This is the puzzle that continues to challenge and fascinate archaeologists, historians, climatologists, everyone who studies the Maya, perhaps more than any other aspect. We're talking about the terminal classic period, roughly spanning from 800 AD to about 925 AD.
And this period saw a collapse, a dramatic decline.
One of the most dramatic and in some ways rapid declines of a complex civilization known in history. The material describes it very starkly, a mass abandonment of the great urban centers in the southern Maya lowlands. This happened primarily between the 7th and 9th centuries AD.
So the very cities we've been talking about, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, Calakmul, the heartland of the classic Maya achievement, they just emptied out.
Essentially, yes. Over a relatively short period, maybe a century or two in most places, monumental construction grinds to a halt. The carving of dated inscriptions stops, royal dynasties disappear from the record, and most dramatically, populations plummet. These once thriving cities were effectively abandoned, left to be slowly reclaimed by the jungle.
Did this happen everywhere in the Maya world?
It primarily affected the southern lowlands, the region covering much of modern Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and southern Mexico. While some northern cities also experienced disruption or transformation, the scale of abandonment in the south was profound. The source doesn't mince words. It calls this one of the greatest unresolved mysteries in archaeology.
So surely, with all the research, all the technology we have today, we must have a definitive answer now. One clear reason why it happened.
Really, if only complex historical events were that simple. The material highlights just how complicated this is by stating there are over 80 different theories, or maybe variations of theories, that have been proposed over the years to explain the classic Maya collapse.
Over 80. Wow. That in itself tells you something.
It absolutely does. It strongly suggests that the collapse wasn't caused by one single isolated factor. The consensus among most experts today, as the material indicates, is that it was a highly complex interplay of multiple interconnected factors, ecological, political, social, that essentially created a kind of perfect storm scenario.
Okay, so not one smoking gun, but a combination of things hitting at once.
Exactly. Let's dive into some of those leading theories discussed in the material. The first one, and perhaps the most prominent in recent decades, is the climate hypothesis, specifically prolonged and severe drought.
We know there were droughts.
Yes. Modern paleoclimate studies analyzing things like lake sediment cores, pollen records, the chemical composition of cave formations like stalagmites provide pretty clear environmental data. They show a series of severe, multi-year droughts hitting the Maya lowlands during the Classic period, with particularly intense pulses concentrated between the 8th and 9th centuries AD. Some studies pinpoint major drought peaks around 810, 860, and 910 AD, right in the time frame of the collapse.
So a massive, long-lasting lack of rain just devastated their ability to grow food.
That's the core argument. The Maya lived in a region, particularly the southern lowlands, with a very distinct wet and dry season. Surface water, like rivers and lakes, can be scarce, especially in the karst limestone landscape. They relied heavily on rainfall for agriculture, especially their staple crop, maize, and they developed complex water management systems, reservoirs, canals to store water for the dry season.
But these droughts were too much for those systems.
It seems likely. Sustained, severe drought, perhaps worse than anything they'd experienced before, would have overwhelmed their storage capacity, led to widespread crop failures, famine, and potentially destabilized the entire society.
But the source material adds a wrinkle. It mentions that not all cities suffered droughts equally. And it raises the question, how could a civilization so advanced in water management be so devastated?
Exactly. Those are the complexities within the drought theory. The impact likely varied across the region. Some areas might have had more resilient water sources or received slightly more rainfall. And it forces us to ask about the limits of their adaptation. Were their water systems sophisticated for their time? Yes, but ultimately insufficient for droughts of unprecedented duration or intensity. Was it a failure of their technology or simply an environmental catastrophe beyond the capacity of any pre-industrial society to fully withstand? It highlights that even clever adaptations have breaking points when faced with extreme, prolonged environmental shifts.
That vulnerability to environmental change ties into the next related theory, demographic and environmental pressure, essentially problems they might have partly caused themselves through their own success.
Right. This theory focuses on the sheer scale of the Maya population during the Classic peak. Archaeological surveys, especially recent ones using LiDAR technology, suggest that cities and the surrounding agricultural landscapes were far more densely populated than we previously imagined. Supporting these huge populations required increasingly intensive forms of agriculture.
Which means clearing more and more land.
Massive deforestation. They needed land for their fields, yes, maize, beans, squash. But crucially, they also needed huge amounts of wood for fuel. Fuel for cooking, firing pottery, and especially for producing lime plaster.
Lime plaster was that important.
Incredibly important. It was the essential ingredient for constructing their monumental buildings, coating the pyramids, palaces, plazas, as well as for making stucco for decoration and paving those sakbi, the white roads. And making lime plaster requires burning limestone at very high temperatures, which consumes enormous quantities of wood.
The material gives a staggering estimate.
It does. Potentially burning up to 20 trees to produce just 1 square meter of high-quality lime plaster.
20 trees. And they were building on a monumental scale across hundreds of cities for centuries.
Exactly. You can imagine the cumulative impact on the forests. Some environmental reconstructions suggest that by around 750 AD, near the height of the Classic period, in the core Maya regions, almost every square meter of land had been modified, in some way cleared for farming, terraced on slopes, or logged for fuel and construction.
So they were fundamentally reshaping their entire landscape. How does that connect back to the drought theory?
It creates a dangerous feedback loop. Intensive, widespread deforestation can actually exacerbate natural droughts. When you remove large areas of forest cover, the ground absorbs more solar radiation and reflects more heat. There's less transpiration moisture released from leaves. This reduces the amount of moisture going back into the atmosphere locally, which in turn can lead to fewer clouds forming and less rainfall in that specific area.
So their own actions clearing forest for farming and building might have made the natural drought significantly worse and longer lasting.
That's the frightening possibility. It suggests their own success. Their intensive land use practices inadvertently sowed the seeds of their own environmental downfall, making them much more vulnerable when the climate shifted towards prolonged dryness.
That's a really haunting thought. A civilization whose cosmology was so deeply tied to nature, rain gods, maize gods, the sacred forest might have contributed to its own ecological unraveling.
It's a powerful, unresolved question, and one that definitely resonates today, doesn't it? How could a people with such deep spiritual connections to the natural world engage in practices that push their environment towards a potential breaking point? Did the immense demands of supporting a complex hierarchical society with its constant need for agricultural surplus and monumental building projects simply outweigh their traditional understanding of ecological balance? Or did they just not foresee the long-term consequences? It's a profound mystery of potential unintended consequences on a civilizational scale.
Beyond these environmental factors, there's also the intense human element discussed in the material, internal conflict and escalating warfare.
Absolutely. The material makes it very clear that the classic Maya city-states weren't always peaceful neighbors cooperating harmoniously. Evidence strongly suggests that warfare became increasingly frequent, intense, and destructive, particularly during the later Classic period, leading up to and during the collapse.
What kind of evidence points to that?
We see it in the archaeological record. More sites built with defensive walls or fortifications, sometimes evidence of destruction layers, even mass graves in some locations. There's also an increase in the findings of projectile points, like arrowheads and spear points, and importantly, the inscriptions themselves change.
How so?
They start to focus more on military victories, the capture and often sacrifice of rival kings and nobles. Texts boast about conquests and dominance over neighbors. It paints a picture of endemic rivalry flaring up into more destructive conflicts.
So at the same time they might be facing resource shortages due to drought and deforestation, they're also busy fighting each other.
It seems so. Powerful city-states like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Tonina, they were engaged in these long-running, bitter rivalries that sometimes erupted into major wars. The sources mention powerful states destroying each other. This constant warfare, often fought over control of territory, resources, trade routes, or simply for political prestige and captives for sacrifice, would have been incredibly disruptive.
Disrupting farming, trade, stability.
Everything. Armies marching through fields, populations displaced, resources diverted to military efforts instead of infrastructure or adaptation. It would have severely weakened their ability to cope with the other mounting pressures.
It seems almost counterproductive fighting amongst yourselves when facing larger environmental threats.
It does, and that's part of the mystery of internal disintegration, isn't it? Why did these rivalries escalate to such mutually destructive levels, seemingly at the worst possible time? Was it a failure of their political systems to manage conflict peacefully? An inability to form broader alliances or cooperative strategies to face collective threats like drought? Or perhaps the inherent nature of their decentralized political system, a collection of competing city-states, each prioritizing its own interests, made them fundamentally vulnerable to fracturing under severe stress. Their apparent inability to forge a unified cooperative response certainly seems to have been a major factor contributing to the collapse.
And finally, the material touches briefly on theories involving external factors, like invasion.
Yes, some theories over the years have proposed that groups from outside the core Maya area, perhaps migrating groups, or maybe people influenced by powerful centers in central Mexico like the Toltec, later on moved into the Maya lowlands and contributed to the collapse, either through direct conquest or by disrupting existing political and economic systems.
Is there evidence for that?
There's some evidence cited, like certain changes in architectural styles or pottery types appearing at some sites during the Terminal Classic period, the presence of non-Maya artifacts or imagery. The material mentions, for example, a supposed Toltec intrusion at the site of Cibol in Guatemala during the 9th century, which some interpret as evidence of external influence or migration.
But is this seen as a primary cause by most experts?
Generally, no. The material reflects the broader consensus here. While external interactions and migrations were certainly part of the Maya world throughout their long history, they had significant interactions with the powerful city of Teotihuacan in central Mexico much earlier, for instance, without collapsing. Most Mayanists don't view invasion as the primary or sole driver of the widespread classic collapse.
Like,
They argue that there's no clear evidence of a single large-scale military conquest that could explain the abandonment of so many cities across such a vast and varied region. The decline seems to have been a more prolonged and complex process, unfolding differently in different places over a couple of centuries. External pressures, like shifting trade routes or migrations, might well have been a contributing factor, perhaps adding stress to already struggling societies, but they're rarely seen as the root cause of the entire phenomenon.
okay, so putting it all together, the picture emerging is one of a really complex, unfortunate, severe prolonged droughts
Hmm.
hitting the region,
Right.
likely made worse by environmental damage from centuries of intensive land use and massive deforestation,
Yeah, that feedback loop.
all happening while the major city-states were increasingly locked in destructive internal warfare,
Weakening each other.
and maybe with some degree of external pressure or disruption adding to the mix. All these factors interacting and amplifying each other's negative effects.
That's the prevailing view now, a multi-causal explanation. It wasn't just one thing, it was the convergence of multiple severe stresses that ultimately overwhelmed the resilience of the classic Maya political and social systems in the southern lowlands. The fact that there are still so many theories, often emphasizing different factors or combinations, just reflects the sheer complexity of this event and the ongoing challenge of unraveling it completely from the archaeological and environmental records. It highlights the profound difficulty in pinpointing exact causes for civilizational collapse anywhere, and it ensures the classic Maya collapse remains one of archaeology's most compelling, debated, and ultimately humbling mysteries.
And perhaps the most poignant, the most unsettling part of the classic collapse isn't just why the magnificent cities fell into ruin, but what happened to the people, the human story behind the empty plazas.
That's the haunting human dimension of this whole enigma, isn't it? The material really emphasizes the dramatic population drops that occurred in the southern lowlands during this period. Cities that were once bustling centers, home to tens of thousands of people, saw their populations just plummet.
Like Tegel.
Tikal is a stark example. A massive urban center, estimates for its peak population vary, but range from maybe 28,000 up to 60,000 or even more in the city and its immediate surroundings. By around 1200 AD, a few centuries after the main collapse phase, estimates suggest fewer than 1,000 inhabitants remained in the area. Think about that scale of depopulation and multiply it across numerous other major cities in the region: Copan, Calakmul, Palenque, Caracal.
Where did all those people go? Tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people.
That is the lingering, chilling question. The material points out a crucial problem. There's a lack of clear, large-scale archaeological evidence for a massive, organized migration that could fully account for the emptying of the entire southern lowlands.
So they didn't just pack up and move north en masse.
There's certainly evidence for some population movement, people shifting to coastal areas, maybe some moving north into the Yucatan where cities continued or rose, or perhaps dispersing into smaller rural settlements. But nothing seems to match the sheer scale of the abandonment observed in the southern core region. A vast area, the material notes something like 60,000 square miles, was left largely deserted or at least dramatically depopulated.
So if they didn't all migrate, they just die off.
It's highly likely that mortality rates increased significantly during this period. Widespread famine resulting from agricultural collapse due to drought, epidemic diseases spreading rapidly through stressed, malnourished populations, increased violence and social breakdown associated with warfare and competition over dwindling resources, but probably a grim combination of factors.
But we don't have direct evidence of mass death on that scale.
Finding direct archaeological evidence for mass mortality events like famine or disease centuries later is incredibly difficult. But the scale of the abandonment strongly suggests a severe demographic crisis occurred, involving both migration and significantly increased mortality. The material doesn't provide a definitive answer on the proportions, and that lack of clarity, the lack of a neat explanation for where everyone went, leaves this as a profound unanswered question. The apparent disappearance of a once thriving, numerous population from their magnificent cities, leaving only silence in the encroaching jungle, that's perhaps the most unsettling and mysterious aspect of the entire classic collapse story.
It certainly makes that popular term lost civilization feel understandable, even if, as you pointed out earlier, it's not technically accurate. Because the story of the Maya doesn't just stop dead in 900 AD with the classic collapse.
Absolutely not. And it's so important to correct that misconception. That phrase, lost civilization, is really misleading and frankly inaccurate. The material is good on this point. The classic collapse was a truly dramatic, transformative event, particularly in the southern lowlands, but it absolutely was not the end of Maya culture or Maya people.
It was more like a major shift, a transformation.
Exactly. The material correctly frames it as a shift of power center. While the great cities in the south declined and were eventually abandoned, Maya civilization continued, adapted, and even experienced something of a renaissance in other regions during the next phase of their history, the post-classic period.
Post-classic. That runs from about 900 AD up to when the Spanish arrived.
That's right, roughly 900 AD until the Spanish conquest began in earnest in 1524. During this period, while the South struggled or was depopulated, urban centers in the northern Yucatan Peninsula, like Chichen Itza, actually continued to flourish and develop, becoming major powers after the southern collapse was underway. Later, other cities like Mayapan rose to prominence in the north.
And what about other areas, like the highlands?
Maya kingdoms in the highlands of Guatemala, like the Quiche or Quiche Kingdom, also rose to prominence and expanded during the post-classic period. So Maya culture adapted, persisted, and thrived in these new centers. They developed somewhat different political structures, new artistic and architectural styles, often showing more influence from central Mexico, but they were undeniably still Maya.
So when the Spanish showed up in the early 16th century, they weren't finding just empty ruins.
Not at all. They encountered multiple distinct functioning Maya states, particularly in the Yucatan Peninsula and the Guatemalan highlands. These were complex societies with their own rulers, priests, armies, and traditions. And the material makes a really important point about the subsequent Spanish conquest of the Maya.
That wasn't quick or easy.
Far from it. It wasn't like the relatively swift fall of the Aztec capital Tenochtitlan. The Spanish invasion of the Maya lands began in the 1520s, but the various Maya states offered fierce, prolonged, and often successful resistance for decades, even centuries.
Century.
Yes. The very last independent Maya polity, the Itza Kingdom, based at their capital Noxpeten, or Tayasal, on an island in Lake Itza, not far from the ruins of ancient Tikal, ironically didn't fall to the Spanish until 1697.
Wow, 1697. That's nearly 200 years after Columbus.
Exactly, almost 2 centuries after the initial arrival of the conquistadors in Mexico. That protracted resistance speaks volumes about their resilience and determination. It wasn't a single unified conquest, but a long, brutal, piecemeal process fought against numerous independent Maya groups who, despite facing internal divisions and the devastating impact of Old World diseases the Europeans brought, fought tenaciously to preserve their independence and way of life.
The material uses the term survivalism to describe this continuity.
Yes, and it's a powerful concept. It argues that it wasn't really a conquest in the sense of completely erasing the people and their culture, because this inherent Maya survivalism, this deep-rooted ability to adapt, resist, and maintain their core identity ensured cultural continuity, even under colonial rule.
And that survival itself, through the classic collapse, through centuries of brutal conquest and colonization, that's maybe another one of the big Maya mysteries, isn't it? The source calls it the mystery of survival.
It absolutely is. How did they do it? Despite facing immense environmental challenges, internal political fragmentation, devastating warfare, catastrophic epidemics, and then centuries of foreign domination and exploitation, Maya culture persisted. Their languages continue to be spoken by millions today. Their traditions, though inevitably blended with new influences over time, endure. Their distinct identity remains strong in many communities. This incredible resilience fundamentally challenges that simplistic, lost civilization narrative more than anything else. It's an ongoing story of adaptation, cultural depth, and an unbreakable connection to their heritage that allowed them to weather centuries of storms.
And it's so crucial to remember, as the Maturi points out, that the Maya aren't just a subject of ancient history books. They are a living culture today.
Exactly. Millions of Maya people continue to live in their ancestral homelands across Mexico and Central America, particularly Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador. And there are also significant Maya communities established elsewhere, including in the United States, due to more recent migration.
And they maintain their own distinct cultures.
Yes, vibrant contemporary cultures that often reflect a fascinating blend of ancient traditions, beliefs, and practices passed down through generations, combined with elements adopted and adapted from the wider Western world and Christianity over the past 500 years. It's a dynamic, living heritage.
And their languages are a key part of that continuity.
Absolutely. It's not just one Maya language. There are numerous distinct Mayan languages spoken today. Quiche, Yucatec Maya, Kachikol, Mam, Quechua, Tzotzil, Tzeltal, and many others. Linguists estimate there are around 30 Mayan languages still spoken. All of these are descended from a common ancestral language, Proto-Maya, spoken thousands of years ago. This linguistic diversity and continuity is perhaps the strongest testament to the fact that this is a living, evolving culture with incredibly deep roots, not a civilization that vanished into the mist.
We've touched on so many mysteries throughout this deep dive: that first pre-classic collapse, the enigma of the classic abandonment, the disappearance of the southern populations, that fascinating blend of science and spirituality, sheer mystery of their survival. The material also guides us toward looking at some even deeper layers of their world, particularly around their religious beliefs, and how new discoveries continue to add complexity.
Yes, understanding Maya religion, or perhaps more accurately, their cosmology and worldview, is fundamental. It wasn't just a separate compartment of life labeled religion. It seems to have been the central organizing principle of their entire world. It connected everything: the past, the present, the future, the heavens, the earth, the underworld, humans, gods, animals, plants, time itself.
How did they actually view the cosmos? What was its structure?
They saw it as a dynamic, often unpredictable, but ultimately interconnected universe that operated through continuous grand cycles of creation, destruction, and rebirth. They generally envisioned the cosmos as having multiple layers, often depicted with 13 levels of heavens above.
13 heavens.
The rectangular Earth, sometimes seen as the back of a giant crocodile or turtle floating in a primordial sea in the middle,
Okay.
and 9 levels of the underworld known as Xibalba below. Xibalba was a dark, fearsome place, ruled by death gods, but also seen as a place of transformation and origin.
And these layers were connected somehow.
Yes, typically by a great cosmic tree, the Waka Chan, often depicted as a giant ceiba tree, whose roots reach deep into Xibalba and branches soared into the heavens, linking all the realms. Their beliefs also often featured a strong dualistic tendency, a perpetual struggle or balance between opposing forces. Life and death, light and darkness, order and chaos, good and evil.
And within this complex cosmology, those practices that seem shocking to us today, the bloodletting rituals, the human sacrifice, they were central, weren't they?
They were absolutely fundamental. The material is very clear that these were not arbitrary acts of cruelty or barbarism, as they were often portrayed by the Spanish. They were deeply meaningful, sacred duties embedded within their core beliefs about how the universe worked.
What was the underlying belief?
The Maya believed that the gods had created the universe and humanity, often using their own divine substance, their own blood, mixed with maize dough in some creation myths. Therefore, humanity owed a profound debt to the gods. To sustain the gods, to nourish them, and to ensure the continuation of the cosmos, the rising of the sun each day, the coming of the rains, the cycles of time humans had to offer tribute back. And the most precious, most potent tribute was Tul, the life essence, which resided most powerfully in blood.
So blood was literally seen as the food of the gods.
Precisely. Blood sacrifice was seen as repaying the gods for the gift of life and maintaining the cosmic balance. This led to rituals of self-sacrifice or bloodletting, where rulers and elites, both men and women, would perforate parts of their bodies, often tongues, ears, or genitals, using sharp objects like obsidian blades or stingray spines. They would collect the blood on paper, which was then burned. The rising smoke was believed to carry the offering, the essence of the blood, directly to the gods.
And human sacrifice was the ultimate offering.
It seems to have been considered the best tribute, the most powerful offering possible, especially in times of crisis or for major state ceremonies like dedicating temples or celebrating military victories. It was seen as a necessary act to appease powerful deities, consecrate sacred spaces, or ensure the cyclical regeneration of the cosmos.
Often happening on top of the pyramids, as we imagine?
Yes, sacrifices were frequently performed at the summits of temples, the highest points physically connecting the earthly realm to the heavens. Methods varied, but often involved heart extraction. Sacrifices also occurred at other sacred locations. It's challenging for us today, from our cultural perspective, to fully grasp the deep spiritual conviction that must have driven these practices. It stemmed from that core belief. Humanity was made from divine sacrifice and therefore had a sacred obligation to reciprocate, to feed the gods with life itself to keep the universe functioning. It reveals a worldview fundamentally different from our own, where the giving of life and blood was a necessary, integrated part of existence and the cosmic cycles.
And the natural landscape itself played a huge role in these beliefs and rituals, too. You mentioned Xibalba. the underworld.
Absolutely. Natural features were often seen as animate, imbued with sacred power. Caves, for example, were frequently seen as entrances to the underworld, places of origin and transformation. Mountains were sacred peaks, homes of ancestors or gods, and perhaps most famously, the cenotes.
The sinkholes in the Yucatan.
Exactly. These natural sinkholes, formed by the collapse of limestone bedrock exposing the groundwater underneath, are very common in the Yucatan Peninsula. For the Maya, they were incredibly sacred. They were vital sources of fresh water in a region often lacking surface rivers, but they were much more than that. They were believed to be chactun, passages to Xibalba, direct portals to the watery underworld.
So the thresholds to another realm.
Yes, and as such, they became major sites of ritual activity. Archaeologists have dredged cenotes, like the famous sacred cenote at Chichen Itza, and found vast quantities of offerings thrown in over centuries, precious objects like jade, gold, copper bells, pottery, wooden artifacts.
And human remains, too.
And yes, human remains as well, indicating that human sacrifices also took place at these sacred portals. The cenotes perfectly underscore the Maya holistic view, where the natural world was completely interwoven with the spiritual. These geological features were simultaneously life-sustaining water sources and terrifyingly sacred gateways to the realm of death and rebirth, embodying the whole cycle.
And it feels like even now, modern archaeology, especially with new technologies, keeps surprising us, revealing new secrets hidden beneath the surface, sometimes literally.
That's one of the most exciting things about studying the Maya today. It's not a static field, it's constantly evolving. New technologies, especially LiDAR light detection and ranging, are completely revolutionizing our understanding.
How does LiDAR work?
It's basically a remote sensing method. An airplane or drone flies over an area sending down millions of laser pulses. By measuring the time it takes for the pulses to bounce back, after filtering out the returns from the tree canopy, scientists can create incredibly detailed topographical maps of the ground surface, revealing structures hidden beneath even the densest jungle for centuries.
So it can see through the trees.
Effectively, yes. It's revealing vast interconnected cityscapes, extensive systems of agricultural terraces and canals, defensive walls, roadways, features that were completely invisible on the ground or through traditional aerial photography. LiDAR is showing us that the Maya world was even more extensive, more populated, and more engineered than we ever imagined.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally changing our understanding of the scale and complexity of their civilization.
Like that hidden pyramid under Palenque we talked about earlier. Technology helped find that.
Yes, that 2024 discovery under the Temple of the Inscriptions is a perfect example of how non-invasive technologies like ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography, which are different from LiDAR but serve a similar purpose of seeing beneath the surface, can lead to these truly anomalous findings that force us to rethink everything.
Finding that much older structure.
Right. Finding that older structure, possibly with Olmec influences dating back to 100 BC, buried beneath Pakal's famous 7th century AD temple. It doesn't just add another layer to Palenque's timeline, it fundamentally changes our view of its development. It shows it was built upon much deeper ancient foundations than we knew, layering meaning and power over time.
And the potential for ritual thunder. That acoustic element.
That possibility, stemming from the discovery of the vertical water conduit within that buried structure, it really reinforces this emerging idea of Maya architecture as being living architecture, not just static buildings, but structures designed to interact with the natural environment, with sound, with human perception and experience in order to facilitate connection to the sacred realms. This idea of sophisticated, almost mystical engineering aimed at creating multi-sensory, immersive spiritual experiences. It's a whole new layer of their genius that we're still just beginning to uncover and appreciate.
What other kinds of enduring enigmas does the material bring to light? Things that maybe these new discoveries touch on but haven't fully solved?
Well, the precise, almost intuitive nature of their astronomical observations, like at El Caracol. How did they achieve such accuracy in tracking celestial bodies without optical instruments? It remains remarkable. The full meaning and function of the sacred cenotes as water sources, as portals, as sites of sacrifice, continues to be a rich area for study and interpretation. And of course, despite all the amazing breakthroughs in deciphering their hieroglyphic writing,
There's still that huge gap.
exactly, the immense, irreplaceable gap in our knowledge left by the deliberate destruction of the vast majority of their codices by the Spanish, that remains an enduring mystery, a permanent shadow. What incredible stories, what scientific knowledge, what philosophical insights, what records records of daily life were contained in those thousands of lost books, while ongoing decipherment of inscriptions on stone and pottery continues to fill in pieces of the puzzle. That void left by the burned codices is a constant, painful reminder of what was lost forever and what we may never know about the full richness and complexity of Maya thought.
Okay, so trying to bring all these incredible, complex threads together, we've traversed a truly remarkable history here. We started with those mysterious origins, way back in the pre-classic period.
Weighing the foundations.
Right. Then moved through the absolutely astonishing peak of the classic period, where their ingenuity in writing, mathematics, astronomy, art, and architecture reached such incredible heights.
A true flourishing.
Then we grappled with the complex, multi-layered, and still debated puzzle of why those magnificent classic cities declined and were abandoned.
The Great Collapse Enigma.
And then, importantly, we witnessed the inspiring, continuing narrative of their resilience, their adaptation, and their survival through centuries of challenge, conquest, and change, right up to the present day.
It's a story that's just filled with these moments of breathtaking brilliance alongside periods of profound vulnerability and crisis. And it's striking that even after decades, maybe centuries of dedicated research, using ever more sophisticated technology, and even unlocking the secrets of their own written language, fundamental questions still persist.
Big questions.
Really big questions. What specific combination of factors truly triggered that initial decline back in the pre-classic and then the much larger, more dramatic collapse at the end of the classic period? Was it more drought, more war, more environmental damage, or a unique confluence? And where did that massive population actually go from the southern lowlands? Was it mostly migration, mostly mortality, or some combination we still can't quite pin down?
And the questions about their creations.
Exactly. What was the full, intended, maybe multi-sensory experience of their sophisticated architecture? That hidden structure at Palenque hints that things were just beginning to imagine architecture designed not just for function or symbol, but for deep, immersive connection to the divine, the cosmos, the underworld. What other secrets are encoded in those stones?
These aren't just minor details we're missing. They feel like central, powerful mysteries still surrounding the Maya.
They absolutely are. And that's why it's so important to keep pushing back against that simplistic, persistent idea of a lost civilization, because the Maya are not lost. They're here today.
A living legacy.
Absolutely. Their survival, their adaptation, the continuation of their diverse cultures and languages through everything they've faced, the collapse, the conquest, the pressures of the modern world. It's arguably one of the most compelling and inspiring parts of the entire Maya story. It is a profound testament to incredible human resilience, to deep cultural roots, and to that enduring capacity to adapt, endure, and thrive against seemingly impossible odds.
So why does diving deep into the world of the ancient and modern Maya matter to you listening to us today? What can we take away from this journey?
Well, I think understanding the Maya offers some really powerful lessons that resonate far beyond the jungle ruins of Mesoamerica. Their story highlights the inherent fragility of even the most advanced and complex societies, especially when faced with overwhelming interacting pressures like environmental change and social conflict.
A cautionary tale, in a way.
Perhaps. It certainly shows us the intricate and often fraught relationship between humanity and our environment. It reveals how even seemingly beneficial practices, like intensive agriculture or monumental construction, if pushed too far or without foresight, can have profound, unintended, negative long-term consequences.
But it's not all negative.
Not at all. It also reveals the incredible power of human ingenuity. Their achievements in math, astronomy, writing, art were extraordinary. It shows the power of knowledge systems, of belief structures, and underscores that deep human capacity for adaptation, for resilience, for survival against what must have felt like insurmountable odds at times.
So what's the ultimate takeaway?
I think ultimately, the Maya story reminds us that history is complex, layered, and full of secrets, often hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. It constantly surprises us, challenges our assumptions about human potential and human vulnerability, and offers these profound insights into the very nature of civilization, its brilliance, its fragility, and its incredible endurance.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, something to ponder. Considering the Maya's remarkable mastery of their natural world, their sophisticated understanding of cycles and systems, and yet their eventual vulnerability to environmental change, partly perhaps of their own making. What does their story prompt you to think about our own relationship with the planet today? About the potential unintended consequences of even our most advanced knowledge and practices? It's definitely a question worth considering long after this deep dive is over.